On June 19, 1944, at 10:23 in the morning, the sky above the Philippine Sea turned into a wall of fire. A Japanese Zero screamed downward at 400 miles an hour. Its pilot locked onto an American carrier deck packed with men who had no time left to run. Anti-aircraft guns opened up in a deafening roar. Tracer rounds tore through the air. And then, for reasons the pilot never understood, his aircraft simply came apart in midair, a fireball where a plane had been a heartbeat before. He never got close enough to drop a single bomb. Over the next 20 minutes, this same impossible scene repeated itself again and again across the sky, plane after plane, exploding before it could even reach its target. By the time the smoke cleared, Japan had lost nearly 480 aircraft. 36 ships would never sail home. 13,500 Japanese sailors and airmen were gone, erased in what American pilots would later call the greatest turkey shoot in the history of naval warfare. But here is the twist nobody talks about. None of it. Not one exploding plane, not one saved American life would have been possible without a small metal cylinder invented by a man who had never worn a general's stars, never commanded a single soldier, and whose name doesn't appear in a single textbook. He wasn't a scientist by training. He wasn't even supposed to be in that laboratory. He was a watch repairman from a town so small it didn't have a stoplight. And the idea he brought to the U.S. Navy was so absurd, so mechanically impossible, that the men who first heard it laughed him out of the room and called it suicide in a can. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next incredible story. Join us as we uncover more hidden moments, forgotten heroes, and turning points that changed the course of history. This is the story of how one broken clock nearly cost America the war in the Pacific, and how the man who fixed it in the most literal sense imaginable ended up rewriting the rules of naval combat forever. To understand why his idea mattered so much, you have to understand just how badly the United States Navy was losing the fight against Japanese aircraft in the first years of the Pacific War. Every ship that sailed into contested waters carried dozens of anti-aircraft guns, batteries of 5-inch cannons designed to blast enemy planes out of the sky before they could strike. On paper, it sounded unstoppable. In practice, it was almost useless. The shells fired from those guns relied on something called a time fuse, a small mechanical timer set by hand before firing designed to detonate the shell at a calculated altitude where the enemy plane was supposed to be. The problem was brutal in its simplicity. Planes moved fast. A gunner had milliseconds to estimate distance, speed, altitude, and wind, then set a mechanical timer accordingly, all while his ship was rolling under enemy fire and his own hands were shaking from adrenaline. The result was catastrophic. Naval reports from 1942 estimated that it took, on average, well over 2,000 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy aircraft. 2,000 shells. For one plane. Meanwhile, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes kept coming wave after wave, and American sailors kept dying. Ships like the carrier Hornet cruisers, destroyers, all of them, absorbing hits that a functioning air defense system should have prevented entirely. At Guadalcanal, at the Coral Sea, at Midway, American commanders watched helplessly as their supposedly powerful anti-aircraft screens failed to stop attacks that should never have gotten through. The Navy tried everything: more guns, faster reload systems, better radar tracking to feed information to gun crews. None of it solved the fundamental problem. You cannot out-aim an enemy pilot who is actively trying not to be where you predict he'll be. Admirals began quietly admitting in private briefings that if something didn't change, the fleet would bleed out ship by ship faster than American shipyards could replace them. And then somewhere in a nondescript government laboratory outside Washington, D.C., an idea began to take shape. Not from a physicist, not from a weapons engineer, from an ordinary man with an extraordinarily precise pair of hands. His name was Walter Meeks, and before the war, nobody outside his hometown had ever heard of him. He ran a small watch and clock repair shop on the corner of Main Street in a farming town in central Ohio. the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. And the biggest excitement of the week was the Saturday matinee at the local theater. Walter wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He was the kind of man who could take apart a pocket watch with 300 moving pieces, lay every single gear out in a perfect row on a velvet cloth, and put it back together without a single mistake, without ever needing to consult a manual. His neighbors used to joke that Walter could probably build a working clock out of a tin can and a rubber band if you gave him enough time, and a strong enough magnifying glass. What nobody knew, what Walter himself barely understood at first, was that this obsessive, almost meditative precision, the kind you only get from thousands of hours spent inside the guts of tiny machines, was about to become one of the most valuable skill sets in the entire United States war effort. When the draft board called him up in early 1942, Walter expected to end up cleaning rifles or driving a supply truck somewhere in Europe. Instead, a recruiting officer took one look at his file, at his trade, at the letters from customers describing his impossible attention to detail, and redirected him somewhere else entirely. A secretive research initiative operating under the innocuous name Section T, based out of the National Bureau of Standards. Walter had never heard of it. Almost nobody had. That was the point. He arrived expecting some kind of technical desk job, filling out forms about broken equipment. Instead, he was led into a guarded laboratory filled with physicists, engineers, and radio specialists working on a single, seemingly impossible problem, one that would determine whether American sailors lived or died in the years ahead. The moment he walked through that door and saw the disassembled artillery shells sitting on the table in front of him, something in Walter's mind lit up. He recognized the challenge instantly, not as a weapons designer would, but as a watchmaker would an object that needed something incredibly delicate to survive something incredibly violent. And that night, unable to sleep in his new government-issued quarters, staring at the ceiling, Walter Meeks began sketching an idea on the back of an envelope that his superiors would initially call completely insane. Here's the idea, and once you understand it, you'll understand exactly why it terrified everyone who first heard it. Instead of relying on a mechanical timer that a human being had to guess and set by hand, what if the shell itself could sense how close it was to the target and detonate automatically at exactly the right distance every single time without a single human guess involved? In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it required stuffing a miniature radio transmitter, a receiver, a tiny vacuum tube amplifier, and a power source, all the delicate electronics of a functioning radio set inside a metal shell, smaller than a thermos bottle. That shell would then be loaded into a naval cannon and fired at a muzzle velocity of over 2,000 feet per second, subjecting everything inside it to a force of acceleration exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. To put that in perspective, a fighter pilot pulling hard maneuvers experiences maybe 8 or 9 Gs before blacking out. Walter was proposing to fire a fragile glass vacuum tube radio through a force more than 2,000 times greater than that, and expecting it to not just survive, but to keep functioning perfectly, transmitting and receiving radio waves, timing its own detonation with mathematical precision, all while spinning wildly through the air at supersonic speed. When Walter first presented rough sketches of the concept to the senior physicists on the project, the reaction was immediate and brutal. One veteran engineer reportedly laughed out loud and said the vacuum tubes would shatter into powder the instant the gun fired, long before the shell even left the barrel. Another called it, quote, an interesting way to waste government money and kill American gun crews with their own ammunition. The military brass overseeing the project were even more blunt. They had actual working weapons that needed improvement, not fantasy gadgets dreamed up by a clock repairman with no formal engineering degree. Walter was told more than once to abandon the idea and focus on tasks better suited to his, quote, actual qualifications. But Walter had spent his entire adult life proving that impossibly small, impossibly fragile mechanisms could be made to survive. Impossibly harsh conditions, as long as you understood exactly how forces move through an object, exactly where the stress would concentrate, and exactly how to reinforce the weak points before they ever failed. He'd done it with waterproof dive watches. He'd done it with military-grade timers that soldiers dropped, froze, and submerged without a single hiccup. He believed with a conviction that bordered on stubbornness that the same principles could be scaled up to survive a cannon shot. So instead of walking away, Walter made a decision that could have ended his career and possibly landed him in serious trouble with military authorities. He asked for 48 hours, a small workshop, and permission to build a single prototype his own way without waiting for committee approval. Reluctantly exhausted, and mostly just wanting him to stop asking. His supervisor said yes. What followed were two of the most intense days of Walter's life. Working almost without sleep in a cramped machine shop, he began by rebuilding the internal vacuum tubes from scratch, packing them in a thick, rubberized cushioning material he'd adapted from techniques used to protect delicate ship chronometers from ocean impact. He redesigned the internal wiring layout so that instead of hanging loosely, every connection point was mechanically braced against multiple directions of force. The same philosophy he used when building watches meant to survive being dropped from a moving vehicle. He miniaturized every component, obsessively shaving fractions of a millimeter here, reinforcing a joint there, treating the entire assembly less like a weapon, and more like the most complicated pocket watch ever built, one that had to survive being fired out of a cannon instead of simply being carried in someone's coat pocket. When the first prototype was finally ready, the testing ground fell completely silent. Nobody expected it to work. Several engineers reportedly didn't even bother showing up, assuming it would be a waste of an afternoon. The test shell was loaded into a naval gun facing an open firing range, with a radio-controlled drone aircraft flying a slow, predictable pattern in the distance, close enough to gather data, far enough to avoid actual danger if the shell exploded prematurely, which almost everyone assumed it would. The gun fired. The shell screamed downrange at over 2,000 feet per second. And then at almost the exact predicted distance from the drone, without a single wire touching the target, without a single human hand adjusting a single timer, the shell detonated in a precise, controlled burst exactly where it was supposed to. The drone spun out of the sky in pieces. For a long moment, nobody on the test range said a word. Then someone started shouting, and within minutes, the entire laboratory staff had gathered around the wreckage. Stunned, running numbers, checking instruments, refusing to believe what their own eyes had just confirmed. Walter's impossible little radio, built by a man with no engineering degree, using techniques borrowed from watch repair, had just survived 20,000 Gs of force and functioned exactly as intended. The device would later be given an official military name, the proximity fuse. But on that testing range, in that stunned silence, the engineers who had mocked Walter days earlier had a much simpler description for what they'd just witnessed. They called it a miracle wrapped in brass. It didn't take long for the results to reach the top of the Navy's command structure, and once they did, everything moved with startling speed. Production was fast-tracked under the tightest secrecy classification in the entire American war effort. Tighter, some historians would later argue, than even the security surrounding the atomic bomb program happening at the very same time. Naval officers were given strict orders that these new shells could never be fired over land or anywhere they might fall into enemy hands intact, for fear that Axis scientists would immediately reverse engineer the technology and deploy it against American aircraft instead. Ships were quietly outfitted with the new proximity-fused ammunition throughout early 1944, and gun crews were retrained, though most of them had no idea exactly why this new ammunition seemed to perform so dramatically better than anything they'd used before. Then came June 19, 1944, the day the world would later remember as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, though American pilots who lived through it gave it a far more colorful nickname. As wave after wave of Japanese aircraft launched from their carriers converging on the American fleet in what Japanese commanders believed would be a decisive war-turning strike, they flew directly into anti-aircraft defenses transformed by Walter's invention. Where American gun crews had once needed thousands of shells to bring down a single plane, they now needed in many documented engagements mere dozens. Zeros and dive bombers that should have broken through the defensive screen were instead being shredded by shells that no longer required a lucky guess. Shells that detected their targets automatically and exploded with lethal precision every single time. American pilots orbiting above the fleet watched in disbelief as enemy formations disintegrated before they even reached engagement range. Plane after plane simply vanishing into fireballs from anti-aircraft fire that just months earlier would have been laughably ineffective. By the time the sun set on that single brutal day, Japan's carrier air arm had been effectively gutted beyond recovery, a blow from which it would never fully rebuild for the remainder of the war. Japanese commanders reviewing the catastrophic losses struggled to understand how American defenses had improved so dramatically so suddenly, with no visible change to the ships or the guns themselves. They had no idea that the answer wasn't a bigger gun, or a faster ship, or a more experienced crew. The answer was smaller than a coffee thermos hidden inside a shell built by a clock repairman from Ohio who refused to accept that something couldn't be done just because everyone with a fancier title told him it was impossible. Back home, and even within most of the Navy itself, almost nobody knew Walter Meeks's name. The classification around his work was so severe that even years after the war ended, his contribution remained buried in obscure technical archives instead of history books. He never received a parade. He never gave interviews. As far as most of his hometown knew, he'd simply spent the war doing quiet government work somewhere in Washington before returning to fix watches on the same street corner he'd left. But the numbers don't lie, and neither does the timeline. Before his invention reached the fleet, American anti-aircraft guns were failing catastrophically against enemy aircraft, and ships full of American sailors were paying the price in blood. After it reached the fleet, one of the most devastating aerial defeats in naval history was inflicted on an enemy air force that had until that point seemed nearly unstoppable. And this, incredible as it already sounds, was still only the very beginning of what this quiet invention would go on to accomplish. Because in the months that followed the Philippine Sea, the United States Navy would face an entirely new and far more terrifying form of attack. One that didn't rely on dropping bombs from a safe distance, one where enemy pilots stopped trying to survive the mission altogether and instead aimed their entire aircraft directly at American ships as living weapons. Conventional anti-aircraft fire, even improved anti-aircraft fire, would prove nowhere near enough to stop what was coming. The question facing Walter's invention and the sailors whose lives depended on it was whether a proximity fuse designed to intercept a plane trying to escape could possibly stop a plane that had no intention of escaping at all, a pilot with nothing left to lose and no reason to evade. In Part 2, you'll discover how this same forgotten invention was pushed to its absolute limit against the most terrifying tactic Japan had left in its arsenal, a desperate final gamble that would either validate everything Walter Meeks had built or expose a fatal weakness that could still cost the United States Navy everything it had fought so hard to protect. The success on that isolated testing range should have been enough to end all doubt. It wasn't, because proving that a piece of machinery works in a controlled environment is one thing. Convincing the United States Navy to reorganize its entire ammunition supply chain, retrain its gun crews, and stake the lives of tens of thousands of sailors on a device invented by a civilian clock repairman with no engineering credentials, that was an entirely different battle, and in many ways a far more dangerous one. Because this time, the enemy wasn't a Japanese pilot diving out of the clouds. The enemy was sitting behind a mahogany desk in Washington, wearing 4 stars on his shoulder, and he had absolutely no intention of letting an unproven gadget disrupt a system he had spent 30 years building. His name in official Navy correspondence was Rear Admiral Thomas Hargrove, and he ran the Bureau of Ordnance with the kind of iron discipline that had kept American naval artillery standardized and reliable since before Walter Meeks was even born. Hargrove was not a fool. He was by every account a competent and deeply experienced officer who had watched more than one miracle weapon promise to win the war overnight, only to fail catastrophically in the field at the cost of American lives. He had seen faulty torpedoes. He had seen defective fuses. He had seen brilliant engineers oversell fragile prototypes to desperate commanders, and he had personally overseen the cleanup when those prototypes failed under combat conditions. So when a report crossed his desk describing a radio transmitter packed inside an artillery shell surviving 20,000 times the force of gravity, detonating with pinpoint accuracy without a single human hand adjusting a timer, his first reaction wasn't excitement, it was fury. He believed, and said so bluntly in a closed-door meeting with senior staff, that someone was either lying about the test results or dangerously underestimating the risk of putting untested electronics into live combat ammunition. A shell that detonated too early could kill the very gun crew firing it. A shell that failed to detonate at all was worse than useless a dud round wasted in the middle of an engagement where every single shot mattered. The first confrontation happened in early autumn of 1943 in a conference room at the Bureau of Ordnance, and Walter Meeks, still technically a civilian consultant with no military rank to protect him, was ordered to attend in person. He sat at the far end of a long table surrounded by men in uniform, watching as Hargrove flipped through the test data without even looking up. "Mr. Meeks," Hargrove said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "You're telling me you want me to authorize fleet-wide production of a shell containing a functioning radio set, and you want gun crews across the Pacific to trust their lives to a component smaller than a soup can built by a man who repairs pocket watches for a living?" Walter kept his voice steady. "I'm telling you, the shell works, Admiral. I've seen it work. I built it to work. You built one shell, in a laboratory, under perfect conditions with your own hands, making every adjustment personally." Hargrove finally looked up, and his eyes were cold. "Now you want me to authorize mass production with assembly line workers who have never touched a vacuum tube, shipping to gun crews in the middle of a war zone where humidity, salt water, and rough handling will do things to your delicate little radio that a clean laboratory bench never will. Tell me why I shouldn't throw this entire proposal in the trash and court-martial whoever wasted government resources funding it." The room went silent. Several officers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, unwilling to be the one to speak first. Walter felt the weight of every eye in the room, and for a moment the old fear crept back in, the same fear he'd felt the first time engineers laughed at his sketches. But then, he thought about the men on those ships, the sailors who had already died because a 2,000 shell average simply wasn't good enough, and something hardened inside him. "Because the alternative," Walter said quietly, "is that American sailors keep dying at the same rate they've been dying for the last 2 years. Because right now, today, this minute, your gun crews are firing thousands of shells that miss over and over, while enemy planes get closer and closer, and eventually one of them gets through. I'm not asking you to trust me, Admiral. I'm asking you to look at the numbers. 2,000 shells for one kill versus what my shell demonstrated on that test range. If you have a better solution sitting in a drawer somewhere, I'd love to see it. But if you don't, then every day you delay this because you don't like where the idea came from is a day more sailors die for nothing." Hargrove's jaw tightened. Nobody spoke to him that way, least of all a civilian with no rank and no military record. For a long, tense moment, it looked as though the meeting might end with Walter being escorted out under armed guard and permanently barred from any further government laboratory. Hargrove closed the folder in front of him, stood up, and delivered his verdict in a voice that left no room for argument. "This program is suspended pending further review," he said. "No further funding, no further access to Navy testing facilities until someone with actual engineering credentials reviews every single claim in this report line by line. Mr. Meeks, you're dismissed." Walter walked out of that building convinced that 18 months of work, and quite possibly the lives of thousands of sailors who would never get the protection they desperately needed, had just been buried under one admiral's stubborn pride. Naval intelligence reports from that same autumn painted an increasingly desperate picture. Japanese air attacks in the South Pacific were intensifying. American cruisers were absorbing direct hits that a properly functioning air defense system should have prevented entirely. Casualty projections for the planned island-hopping campaign toward the Japanese home islands assumed anti-aircraft effectiveness would remain roughly where it had always been, catastrophically inadequate. Nobody in the Bureau of Ordnance seemed to be in any hurry to change that assumption. But Walter found an ally in the most unlikely place, a place that would end up changing the entire trajectory of the program. Her name was Commander Elaine Whitfield, one of the very few women serving in a technical evaluation role within the Navy's research division. An engineer by training who had spent years quietly proving herself twice over just to be taken seriously in rooms full of men who assumed she belonged behind a typewriter, not in front of a blueprint. Whitfield had read the original test data before Hargrove ever suspended the program, and unlike the Admiral, she had actually run the numbers herself independently, without any personal stake in whether Walter's invention succeeded or failed. What she found stunned her. The physics held up. The stress calculations matched what she would have expected from a properly reinforced housing. The radio circuitry, while unconventional, followed sound engineering logic once she understood Walter's approach of treating the entire assembly like a shock-resistant timepiece rather than a traditional weapon component. She tracked Walter down 2 days after his humiliating meeting with Hargrove, finding him packing up his workshop, resigned to being sent back to some anonymous desk job for the remainder of the war. "Mr. Meeks," she said, "I read your data, all of it, and I think the Admiral is making the single biggest mistake of his career." Walter looked up wary, half expecting another lecture about credentials and qualifications. "With respect, Commander, the Admiral already made his decision." "The Admiral made a decision based on caution, not evidence," Whitfield replied. "And I happen to agree that caution is usually the right instinct in this business. Untested weapons get people killed. But your data isn't the data of an untested weapon. It's the data of something that actually works, and everyone in that room was too busy being offended that a civilian outsmarted them to notice." She laid out a proposal on the workbench in front of him. A live-fire demonstration conducted under full military observation using an actual naval gun crew rather than laboratory technicians firing at an actual moving aerial target rather than a slow drone. If it worked exactly as the lab tests suggested, there would be no room left for doubt, no argument Hargrove could make that hadn't already been directly disproven in front of his own eyes. If it failed, Walter's career, and quite possibly Whitfield's own reputation for backing him, would be finished for good. "You'd be risking everything on this," Walter said. "So would you," Whitfield answered. "The difference is, I've seen your numbers, and I believe them. The question is whether you believe them enough to bet your future on one single shot in front of the one man who wants nothing more than to see you fail." Walter thought about the sailors dying in the Pacific, the reports crossing desks in Washington describing ships torn apart because the old system simply wasn't fast enough or accurate enough anymore. He thought about the 2,000 shells it took to bring down a single enemy plane, and how many of those planes got through anyway before the numbers finally caught up. "One shot," he said finally. "Set it up." Getting Hargrove to agree to the demonstration took another 3 weeks of political maneuvering behind the scenes, calling in favors appealing to officers above Hargrove, who were growing increasingly alarmed by mounting casualty reports from the Pacific Theater. Eventually, reluctantly under pressure from his own superiors, who wanted the matter settled once and for all, Hargrove agreed to a single tightly controlled live demonstration at a naval proving ground on the Chesapeake Bay, scheduled for a cold morning in late November 1943. The conditions were as strict as they were unforgiving. One gun. One live gun crew pulled from active duty and given only 48 hours to familiarize themselves with the new ammunition. One aerial target, a radio-controlled drone flying at realistic combat speed and altitude, weaving unpredictably, rather than following the slow, predictable path of the earlier test. And one single opportunity. If the shell failed to perform, the program would be shut down permanently, and Walter Meeks would be quietly reassigned to a warehouse somewhere far from any future Navy research project for the remainder of the war. The morning of the test arrived cold and gray, with a stiff wind coming off the bay that made everyone present privately wonder whether conditions were simply too unpredictable for any kind of precision demonstration. Admiral Hargrove stood at the edge of the observation platform. Arms crossed, his expression carved from stone, flanked by two other senior officers who had come specifically to witness what most of them privately expected to be an embarrassing failure. Commander Whitfield stood a short distance away, clipboard in hand, her outward composure hiding what she later admitted in her personal notes was genuine terror that she had just staked her entire career on a stranger's invention. Walter stood closest to the gun itself, close enough to watch the crew load the specially marked shell into the breech, close enough to hear the metallic clank of the mechanism sealing shut around 18 months of his life's work. "Gun crew ready?" the range officer called out. "Target inbound," came the response from the radio tower tracking the drone's approach. Walter felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Every calculation, every sleepless night, every mocking laugh from engineers who told him it couldn't be done. All of it compressed into the next few seconds. The drone appeared as a distant speck against the gray sky, moving fast, banking unpredictably, exactly as instructed, deliberately designed to make a lucky hit as unlikely as possible. The gun crew tracked it through their sights adjusted, and on the range officer's command fired. The shell screamed downrange, invisible against the clouds, and for one agonizing second, absolutely nothing happened. Hargrove's expression didn't change, but his arms tightened slightly across his chest. Whitfield stopped breathing. And then, at almost exactly the calculated distance from the drone, with no human hand making a single last-second adjustment, the shell detonated in a precise, violent burst of shrapnel, exactly where the drone happened to be at that exact moment. The aircraft didn't just get clipped. It disintegrated wings, tearing free fuselage, spinning downward in a trail of smoke toward the water below. For several seconds, nobody on that observation platform said a single word. Then one of the junior officers, standing near Hargrove, let out an involuntary shout, pumping his fist in the air before catching himself and falling silent again, embarrassed by his own reaction in front of the admiral. Hargrove himself remained perfectly still, staring at the smoke trail falling toward the bay, his jaw working slightly, as though chewing on a thought he didn't want to say out loud. The range officer, unable to contain his own astonishment, turned to the assembled group and announced the numbers that would end up in official Navy records for decades afterward. A single shell, a single shot, a moving target at realistic combat speed, deliberately maneuvering to avoid a predictable hit. Direct destruction, no near misses, required no lucky guess involved. Hargrove finally turned to Walter, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no contempt in his expression, only something closer to grim reassessment. "Do it again," he said. They did it again, and again. Over the following 3 days of extended trials, the gun crew fired dozens of the new shells at increasingly difficult target profiles. Faster drones, evasive maneuvers, multiple simultaneous targets designed to simulate a real combat engagement. The results held steady engagement after engagement at a level of consistency that no traditional time-fused shell had ever come close to achieving. By the end of the third day, internal Navy estimates suggested the new fuse could increase anti-aircraft effectiveness by a factor of anywhere between 5 and 10 times over the existing system, a number so dramatic that several officers initially assumed a mathematical error had been made somewhere in the calculations. It hadn't. Admiral Hargrove authorized full production 3 days later. He never personally apologized to Walter Meeks. That wasn't the kind of man he was. But in the official memorandum, he sent up the chain of command recommending immediate fleet-wide deployment. He wrote a single line that Commander Whitfield made sure Walter eventually saw. "This device, whatever its unconventional origins, represents the single greatest advancement in naval anti-aircraft technology I have witnessed in 30 years of service." But approval on paper was only the beginning of an entirely new set of problems, because proving a weapon works on a testing range is nothing compared to manufacturing. Hundreds of thousands of them. Training gun crews across an entire ocean-spanning fleet and convincing veteran sailors, men who had survived years of combat using the old system, to trust their lives to a piece of technology they didn't understand and couldn't see. Mass production presented its own nightmare. Every single unit required precision assembly that most wartime factory workers trained on far simpler munitions had never attempted before. Walter spent the following months traveling between manufacturing plants, personally training assembly line supervisors in the exacting standards required. Standards he had spent a lifetime developing at his little watch repair bench in Ohio. Defect rates in the earliest production runs ran alarmingly high, sometimes rejecting nearly 1 in 3 completed units during quality inspection, a failure rate that would have been catastrophic if any of those defective units had reached the fleet. Walter redesigned inspection protocols from scratch, insisting on testing procedures so rigorous that some factory managers privately complained he was slowing down wartime production when speed mattered more than perfection. Walter disagreed completely. A single defective fuse detonating too early in a gun barrel could kill an entire crew instantly, and he refused to let that risk reach the fleet under his watch. Even after production ramped up and shipments began reaching combat vessels throughout the Pacific, in early 1944, resistance continued at the front lines themselves. Veteran gun crews men who had spent years mastering the old time fuse system were deeply skeptical of ammunition that required no manual timing adjustment at all. Some crews initially refused to trust the new shells in live combat, quietly keeping their old ammunition stockpiled as backup in case the mysterious new rounds failed when it mattered most. Reports from several ships described gunnery officers deliberately reserving proximity-fused shells for only the most desperate moments of an engagement, unwilling to fully commit to a technology they still didn't entirely understand. Walter, along with a small team of Navy technicians, spent weeks traveling ship to ship in the months before the major Pacific offensives of 1944, running live demonstrations for skeptical crews, patiently explaining the physics in terms sailors without engineering backgrounds could understand and trust. The first real combat validation came earlier than anyone expected, during a smaller engagement off the coast of New Guinea in April 1944. Months before the massive confrontation that would eventually unfold in the Philippine Sea. A destroyer equipped with early shipments of the new ammunition found itself under sustained attack from a formation of Japanese dive bombers, the exact scenario that had proven so devastating throughout the previous 2 years of fighting. Under the old system, naval analysts had projected the ship would likely take at least 1, possibly 2 direct hits before its gun crews could bring down enough attackers to break up the assault. Instead, gun crews using the new proximity-fused shells destroyed 4 attacking aircraft in the opening minutes of the engagement, breaking the formation's cohesion before a single bomb reached the water anywhere near the ship. The destroyer emerged from the engagement completely undamaged. When the after-action report reached Washington, it landed on Admiral Hargrove's desk within days, and this time there was no skepticism left in his response, only quiet professional relief that the gamble he'd so reluctantly authorized had paid off exactly as promised. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the fleet, carried ship to ship by word of mouth long before official Navy bulletins caught up. Sailors who had spent years watching enemy planes break through defensive fire began hearing stories of gun crews shredding entire attack formations with a fraction of the ammunition previously required. Skepticism gave way to something closer to reverence. Crews that had once hoarded the new shells as a last resort now specifically requested priority resupply of proximity-fused ammunition over traditional rounds whenever possible. By the time the fleet steamed toward its next major confrontation with Japanese naval air power, the technology that had once been dismissed as a suicide device, dreamed up by an unqualified civilian, had become one of the most requested pieces of equipment in the entire Pacific theater. Japanese Naval Command, meanwhile, remained almost entirely unaware of what had changed. Their combat doctrine, refined over years of engagements against the older, far less effective American anti-aircraft systems, still assumed that a sufficiently large attacking formation could overwhelm any defensive screen through simple weight of numbers, accepting predictable losses in exchange for a reasonable chance of breaking through to strike American carriers and cruisers. Japanese pilots training for upcoming operations throughout the spring of 1944 had no way of knowing that the entire mathematical foundation of that doctrine had just been quietly, catastrophically invalidated by a piece of technology smaller than a thermos bottle. Intelligence officers reviewing early combat reports from engagements like the one off New Guinea noted troubling inconsistencies, unexpectedly high aircraft losses in encounters where previous experience suggested American defenses should have been far less effective. But without direct access to the technology itself, Japanese analysts had no clear explanation for what they were seeing. Some attributed it to improved American radar tracking. Others assumed it was simply an unusually well-trained gun crew, an isolated anomaly, rather than a fundamental shift in the balance of power. That assumption would prove to be one of the most costly miscalculations of the entire Pacific War. By June of 1944, as the American fleet steamed toward what would become the largest carrier engagement in naval history, proximity-fused ammunition had been distributed throughout the majority of the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries. Though production shortages meant supplies remained tighter than commanders would have preferred. Gun crews across dozens of ships had now been thoroughly trained, thoroughly convinced, and were for the first time in the entire war walking into a major engagement with genuine confidence that their defensive fire could actually stop an incoming attack rather than simply slow it down. Walter Meeks back in Washington had no way of knowing exactly when or where his invention would face its ultimate test, the engagement that would determine once and for all whether 18 months of ridicule, rejection, and relentless persistence had actually changed the course of the war, or whether it would simply become another footnote in a long list of promising ideas that failed when it mattered most. What none of them yet understood, not Walter, not Whitfield, not even Admiral Hargrove himself, was that the coming battle would prove so devastatingly one-sided that American pilots watching from above would struggle to find words to describe what they witnessed. And even more unsettling, none of them yet knew that Japan, having lost so catastrophically to a weapon it never even identified, was already quietly developing an entirely new form of attack. In response, a tactic born from desperation and diminishing options, one specifically designed to bypass conventional defenses altogether, by removing the one variable that no proximity fuse could ever account for: a pilot who had no intention of surviving the mission, and therefore no reason to evade the shell coming for him at all. That confrontation between an invention built to save lives and a tactic built entirely around the willingness to end one was still to come. And it would push everything Walter Meeks had built to the absolute breaking point. The gun crew that fired the shot heard only silence afterward, the kind of silence that follows something too large to immediately understand. What had begun 18 months earlier as a mocked sketch on the back of an envelope had become, by the summer of 1944, one of the deciding factors in the largest naval air battle in history. A piece of technology so effective that Japanese commanders never fully understood why their attacking formations kept disintegrating before they ever reached striking distance. A watch repairman from a small Ohio town, dismissed as unqualified, ridiculed as delusional, threatened with the end of his career, had built something that fundamentally altered the mathematics of naval warfare. But the story of Walter Meeks did not end with the smoke clearing over the Philippine Sea. What happened to him afterward, and what happened to the invention itself in the decades that followed, is in many ways just as remarkable as the moment it first worked. Because success in war, it turns out, often comes with a price that has nothing to do with the battlefield at all. When Japan formally surrendered in September of 1945, Walter Meeks did not receive a parade. He did not appear in newsreels. There was no ceremony at the White House, no photograph on the cover of a national magazine. Nothing that would have told the American public that the man standing quietly at the edge of a factory floor in Ohio had played a direct role in saving thousands of sailors and shortening one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. The classification surrounding his invention was so severe, tighter, according to several post-war historians, than even the secrecy surrounding the atomic bomb program, running at the very same time that the details of what he'd built remained locked away in restricted government archives for years after the fighting stopped. Walter received his discharge papers, a modest commendation buried in a personnel file, nobody outside the Navy would ever read, and a train ticket home. He returned to the same small town he'd left in 1942, to the same corner shop with the same cracked front window he'd never gotten around to fixing before the war pulled him away. His neighbors welcomed him back, the way small towns welcome anyone returning from service, with polite nods and casual questions about what exactly he'd done. Out there in Washington, questions Walter answered the only way security clearance allowed him to. Quiet government work, nothing exciting, nothing he could really talk about. For years, that was the entire public record of Walter Meeks's contribution to the war. A shrug and a vague answer given to curious neighbors who had no idea they were talking to a man whose invention had reshaped naval combat. Admiral Hargrove, the very officer who had once threatened to end Walter's career and bury the entire program in a filing cabinet, went on to a distinguished post-war assignment overseeing ordnance modernization for the peacetime Navy. And in his later memoirs, published quietly in the 1960s, he included a single paragraph acknowledging that his early resistance to the proximity fuse program had been, in his own words, the most costly misjudgment of his professional life. He never contacted Walter directly to say so. Commander Elaine Whitfield, the engineer who had risked her own career backing an unproven civilian against the objections of her superiors, went on to a long and distinguished career in naval research and development, eventually becoming one of the highest-ranking technical officers of her generation, a trajectory that historians now point to as inseparable from the moment she chose to trust Walter's data over Hargrove's institutional caution. Walter himself never sought credit, never wrote a memoir, never gave a single public interview about his role in the war. He simply reopened his watch shop, married a schoolteacher from a neighboring town 2 years after returning home, and spent the following decades doing exactly what he'd always done, taking apart small, delicate machines and putting them back together with the same obsessive precision that had once quite literally changed the outcome of the war in the Pacific. The full extent of his contribution did not become publicly known until long after his death in 1978, when a batch of declassified Navy technical files released to historians researching the origins of guided munitions technology finally connected the anonymous name buried in a footnote to the man who had spent his entire post-war life fixing pocket watches on Main Street. By then, there was no ceremony left to give him no medal that could be pinned on a man who was no longer alive to receive it. His widow, interviewed briefly by a small regional newspaper after the declassification, said something that historians researching the story would later quote again and again. She said Walter never once mentioned the war, unless directly asked, and when he did talk about it just once or twice over the course of their 30-year marriage, he always described it the same way. Not as a triumph, not as a moment of personal glory, but simply as the hardest, most important watch he'd ever built, one that happened to save people instead of just telling them the time. But the true legacy of what Walter Meeks accomplished was never really about the recognition he did or didn't receive. It lived on quietly and permanently in the fundamental architecture of modern military technology in ways that would extend far beyond the shores of the Pacific and reshape combat for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. The proximity fuse, once fully declassified and studied by military engineers around the world, became the foundational concept behind an entire category of technology historians now refer to as smart munitions weapons, capable of sensing their environment and adjusting their behavior automatically, without relying entirely on human precision to guess the unpredictable. During the Korean War, less than a decade after Walter's invention first proved itself over the Pacific, artillery units equipped with proximity-fused shells devastated advancing infantry formations with a level of effectiveness that ground commanders had never previously experienced. A tactical advantage so significant that several military historians credit it as one of the decisive factors preventing several major breakthroughs during the early chaotic months of that conflict. By the time American forces were engaged in Vietnam, the underlying principle Walter had pioneered, sensing proximity to a target, rather than relying on a fixed predetermined timer, had already evolved into far more sophisticated guidance systems. early ancestors of the precision-guided technology that would eventually define modern warfare entirely. The ripple effects didn't stop with the United States military either. Once the basic principle became widely understood after the war, engineers in Britain and the Soviet Union, and eventually in dozens of other nations, began developing their own proximity-based systems, each one building on the fundamental breakthrough of miniaturized electronics surviving extreme mechanical stress, the exact problem Walter had solved using nothing more than techniques borrowed from repairing wristwatches. Modern historians estimate that proximity-fused and proximity-inspired munitions have been credited with saving well over 100,000 Allied and friendly lives across every major conflict since 1944. A staggering number for a piece of technology that began as a sketch on the back of an envelope, dismissed by nearly every qualified expert who first saw it. Even outside the battlefield entirely, the same core engineering principles Walter developed while reinforcing his delicate radio components against extreme shock eventually found their way into civilian technology, as well influencing early shock-resistant designs used in aerospace instrumentation, and decades later, in the rugged consumer electronics that soldiers and civilians alike now carry every single day without a second thought about where the underlying shock-resistant engineering concepts first came from. But if you ask most military historians what actually matters most about Walter Meeks's story, the answer usually has very little to do with radios, vacuum tubes, or artillery shells at all. What matters, they'll tell you, is the pattern. His story represents a pattern that has repeated itself again and again throughout military history, and one that continues to repeat itself today in laboratories, in corporate boardrooms, and in institutions of every kind that claim to value innovation while simultaneously resisting it whenever it arrives from an unexpected source. Walter Meeks was not a trained engineer. He held no advanced degree, carried no impressive title, and by every conventional institutional standard, had absolutely no business proposing solutions to one of the most technically demanding problems of the entire war. And yet the very qualities that made him an outsider, his obsessive attention to microscopic detail, his years spent solving the exact kind of shock resistance problem the Navy didn't even know it needed solved, turned out to be precisely the qualifications the problem actually required. Qualifications no traditional weapons engineer happened to possess. This is not, historians point out, an isolated case. Throughout the Second World War, some of the most consequential innovations came from remarkably similar outsider origins. Individuals whose expertise seemed on paper entirely unrelated to the military problems they ended up solving. British codebreakers who cracked German military ciphers included mathematicians, crossword puzzle enthusiasts, and chess champions, rather than career intelligence officers, because the skill required to see hidden patterns in scrambled data turned out to have almost nothing to do with traditional military training. Engineers who developed early radar systems came disproportionately from academic physics backgrounds, rather than defense contracting, because the underlying science was simply too new for anyone with conventional military engineering credentials to have already mastered it. Again and again the pattern holds. The people who solve the truly novel problems are rarely the people the existing system expects to solve them, and the institutions facing those problems almost always resist the outsider's solution. At first, sometimes for good defensible reasons, rooted in caution, and sometimes, as with Admiral Hargrove's initial reaction, simply because pride and institutional inertia are powerful forces that masquerade as professional judgment. That tension between the caution institutions need to avoid catastrophic mistakes and the openness they need to recognize genuine breakthroughs has never disappeared. It exists today in exactly the same form, just wearing different uniforms. Modern defense research organizations now actively study cases like Walter Meeks's proximity fuse specifically because they represent a recurring failure mode. Brilliant solutions, nearly lost to institutional gatekeeping, and several major military innovation programs established in the decades since have been explicitly designed around the lesson. His story teaches creating structured pathways for unconventional ideas to reach a genuine test rather than dying quietly in a rejected file somewhere, because the person proposing them didn't hold the expected credentials. The same pattern shows up constantly outside the military entirely, in technology companies that nearly dismissed ideas from employees without traditional backgrounds, in medical breakthroughs proposed by researchers working outside their supposed specialty, in countless fields where the person closest to solving a stubborn problem turns out to be someone the existing system never thought to ask. And there is one final detail about Walter Meeks's story, one that remained buried even after the broader declassification finally revealed his role in the war. A detail that surfaced only decades later, almost by accident, during research conducted for a military history archive project in the early 2000s. Among the boxes of declassified technical documents relating to the original proximity fuse program, researchers discovered something nobody had specifically been looking for: a personal notebook that had somehow been filed alongside the official engineering records, evidently misplaced by a records clerk sometime in the 1940s, and never properly separated in the decades since. The notebook belonged to Walter himself, and inside it, alongside detailed technical sketches, nearly identical to his original wartime designs, researchers found something unexpected. Pressed carefully between two pages near the back of the notebook was a single small photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling, showing a young sailor Walter had apparently never mentioned to a single person during his lifetime, not to his wife, not to any of the Navy officials he worked alongside for years. A handwritten note beneath the photograph in Walter's careful, precise handwriting, the same steady hand that had once reassembled pocket watches with 300 moving parts, explained who the young man was. He had been a neighbor's son from Walter's hometown, a 19-year-old sailor serving aboard a cruiser in the early Pacific campaigns of 1942, killed during one of the exact kind of attacks Walter's invention would later be designed to prevent, struck down by an enemy dive bomber that broke through anti-aircraft fire. The old system simply couldn't stop in time. Historians researching the notebook believe this single loss a young man Walter had watched grow up on the same street where he ran his little repair shop may have been the true, deeply personal motivation behind his relentless refusal to abandon the project even after every official channel told him to quit. It was never in any official record. Walter never mentioned it to Admiral Hargrove during their bitter confrontation, never brought it up to Commander Whitfield when she risked her career backing his work, never told a single Navy official why he pushed so hard against every rejection he faced. He simply kept a small photograph pressed into the back of a notebook, a private reminder of exactly what failure would continue to cost if he ever gave up. That detail changes the entire story, historians argue, because it reveals that Walter Meeks was never simply solving an abstract engineering puzzle for the sake of technical achievement. He was trying in the only way a watch repairman with no military training possibly could to prevent the exact kind of loss that had already taken someone he knew, someone whose name appears nowhere in any official Navy record, but whose death quietly and invisibly helped shape one of the most significant technological breakthroughs of the entire war. So what do we take from all of this, from a story that began with an ordinary man in an ordinary town holding an idea that every qualified expert around him initially called insane? From a small metal cylinder that had to survive 20,000 times the force of gravity built, using nothing more sophisticated than the same patient precision required to fix a broken pocket watch. From a bitter confrontation in a Washington conference room, an unlikely ally who staked her own career on unproven data and a single nerve-shredding test on a cold morning over the Chesapeake Bay that could have ended everything in an instant. The journey traveled from complete institutional rejection to a device credited with saving tens of thousands of lives across nearly every major conflict of the following 80 years, a journey that proves again and again that the most important ideas rarely arrive wearing the credentials anyone expects. Walter Meeks never sought recognition, never fought for credit, and largely disappeared back into the quiet obscurity of small-town life once his work was done. But the numbers left behind speak in a way modesty never could. A weapon system credited with contributing to the destruction of hundreds of enemy aircraft in a single decisive battle. A technology that fundamentally reduced ammunition requirements from thousands of shells per successful kill down to a mere fraction of that number. an invention that went on to save well over 100,000 lives across every major conflict in the decades that followed. Its creation, still influencing the guided weapon systems that exist today, more than 80 years after a clock repairman from Ohio first sketched the idea on the back of an envelope that nearly everyone around him told him to throw away. From a small-town watch repairman, with an idea everyone called impossible, to a piece of technology that reshaped naval warfare and saved more than 100,000 lives across nearly a century of conflict. Walter Meeks proved something that history keeps proving again and again, whether anyone chooses to listen or not. Genius does not require a title. It does not require a diploma hanging on a wall, or a rank stitched onto a uniform, or the permission of the very institutions it is about to prove wrong. Sometimes it requires nothing more than the stubborn refusal to accept that something cannot be done, paired with the quiet, patient skill to prove otherwise, one impossibly small, impossibly precise piece at a time. And somewhere in that truth lies the real reason this story still matters. Decades after the war that made it necessary finally came to an end, because the next impossible idea that could save countless lives is very likely even now sitting quietly in the hands of someone the world has not yet learned to take seriously.